welcome to the story of the Shearer. My name's Annie Brown. I'm the rural reporter at ABC Goulburn Murray here in Albury Wodonga. I think that's why I got asked to come do the shearing panel today. Can see where that went. But yeah, I want to say thank you for coming along today. It's great to have so many people in the room. It's great to have an audience for these things. Otherwise, it's just the four of us talking to ourselves. And because we are here in Albury, it's also important for us to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people and their elders past, present and future. And this is the land that we are on today. Now, Australia is said to have ridden on the sheep's back, but how accurate are our cultural depictions of shearing? Well, today we're going to talk about this idea through Tom Roberts's iconic image that if you turn to your right, you can see here on the wall, Shearing the Rams, which, as many as you will know in this room, has a local connection too, just downstream in Corowa. We're going to talk a bit about what does this painting say about people who live in rural Australia, people like us here today. Does it still reflect rural Australia, and how accurate it was for the time as well, in which it was painted back in 1890. We're also going to talk a bit about the people who are missing from this painting a little bit as well, because as you can imagine, it wasn't just bloke shearing rams back in 1890 in Corowa. There was a lot of other people around doing things. So to answer all these questions, we've got these three wonderful guests here today, and we'll introduce them all now to you. First of all, we've got Sophie Gerhard, who is the curator of Australian and First Nations at the National Gallery of Victoria. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you.
Sophie, first of all, do you want to tell us a bit about your job at the NGV? It sounds like a pretty good job.
Yeah, it's fun. I've been at the NGV for around 6 years now, and yeah, as you said, I'm curator of Australian and First Nations art, and that's an interesting position to be in. You know, I spent a lot of the time at NGV just being Australian art curator, and then the departments amalgamated in the last couple of years. So it's this, you know, real tricky undertaking of trying to present the story of Australian and First Nations under this kind of kaleidoscopic umbrella. We're trying to paint the history of Australia and this continent, this, you know, huge colony, and tell as many stories under that narrative as we can. So it's a big undertaking, and it's really exciting. I get to speak about historical Australian artists, as well as historical and contemporary First Nations as well.
And the NGV is of course home to Shearing the Rams.
We are. It's our bread and butter. This one. we talk about it a lot. It's great.
Thanks, Sophie. In the middle here, author Kate Grenville, who is shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and is the author of the Right Around the Murray's 2024 book of the festival, Restless Dolly Maunda. Hi, Kate. Thanks for being here.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You've written two books that actually deal with shearing, or shearing comes up in your work a bit.
Well, I have, but I hope nobody asks me any hard questions, either about sheep or shearing. But my grandfather, who I knew quite well, was a shearer, and I vividly remember his old blades, which he kept wrapped up in an old singlet when he came to live with us. And I remember trying to close them, and even with both hands, I couldn't hold new respect. And my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father-in-law, was in fact a champion shearer up near Tamworth. 220 sheep in a day with the blades is the story. It seems like I can't quite believe it. Anyway, that's my connection with sheep.
I imagine his back must have been aching after that. And in the end here, Andrew Whitehead, medal sculptor from Urana, not too far down the road, Andrew.
That's right. I'm a local boy out here.
And Andrew, you've also got some pictures on display here further up on the right, some of your sculptures. You spent a long time looking at this painting, haven't you?
Yes, I had to study it in great detail because I thought I knew a little bit about shearing, but I discovered I didn't. And I spent a lot of time, compulsory time, in the Urana pub talking to shearers, which was for research only.
Yeah.
And And they gave me the good oil on blade shearing and a few little things that they told me that I then went back to the painting and found those on the painting and then incorporated them into the artwork. I live on a farm our family's had since 1880, and we've had a shearing shed as long as that, so that sort of thing went on our farm many years ago.
Wow. And so we'll talk a little bit about today as well, your sculptures. If you look behind you in the audience, they're up here on the wall, depicting the main shearer here in this painting. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I was commissioned to make a representation of the painting by the community of Losedale, which is located about 10 kilometres from where the shearing shed used to be that Tom Roberts did his sketches to make the painting. So it was a local project for the local community, using artefacts from that community, and there was other links and connections to the community in that artwork. So it was a good project to get onto.
Very good. Well, thank you all for being here today and being our panel. And just to let everyone in the audience know, we're going to talk till about midday today, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end for any questions, so a bit of a Q&A session. So if there's something you hear in this talk today and you think, oh, I want to ask a question about that, hold on to it and we'll come to it at the end. Well, to start off, let's talk art history and go all the way back to the late 19th century when Shearing the Rams was created. Sophie, can you tell us a bit about how this painting came to be?
Yeah, so Tom Roberts was one of the four main Australian Impressionists, alongside Charles Conder, Frederick McCubbin and Arthur Streeton. And this work was completed, in 1890. That's right? Yeah.
1890, yeah.
It's one of those facts that I have to say time and time again, and
I've said 1980 once and I realised that wasn't quite right.
No, 1890. And so the story is that he visited a lot of shearing sheds across Victoria and settled on one, Brocklesby Station in Corowa, on Yorta Yorta country. And he went back there time and time again, where he made a lot of sketches and painted on plein air, which was the kind of typical nature of the Impressionists at the time. And this work took him a long time to complete. He finished it back in his studio back in Melbourne at Grosvenor Chambers on Swanston Street. And the shearers were rock stars, in the 1890s. The scorecards for how many sheep that they managed to shear were published in all of the local newspapers. It was really they were like footballers, So I think that your grandfather would have been...
That's where I found that bit of information.
Oh, right, there you go. Yeah, so... And this was a time when, the centenary of Australia's federation was just, celebrated in the early 1880s. And, non-Indigenous Australians were, for the first time, outnumbering the migrant population. So the natural-born Australians. So this was the first generation of them in this country. So they were trying to grapple with these ideas of who we are in Australia, what makes us Australian and different to our, empirical cousins over in England. And the shearers and these kind of agricultural icons really made up that narrative alongside bushrangers, for example, and the pioneer narrative was still something that was being depicted in art. So Shearing the Rams garnered a lot of attraction when it was painted in 1890. He did try and sell it to the National Gallery of Victoria, but they were very conservative still at this point. And George Follingsby, who was the director of the gallery, rejected it, said that it wasn't what they would be producing at the National Gallery School at the time. This garnered a lot of negative attention for the gallery. I think somebody in the newspaper published that if the gallery was any what did they say? Something like if there was any Australianness in the gallery directors at all, you'd be purchasing this painting. But anyway, it was rejected. And it was bought for 350 guineas by a huge stockman of a sheep shearing station in Victoria, and it was hung in his office until the late 1930s, after Roberts had passed away. And then it was finally bought by the National Gallery of Victoria, and that's where it's been ever since.
Wow. It's quite a journey. I want to talk a bit about, I guess, all of your memories, I guess, of this painting, because it is quite iconic. I mean, when we say Shearing of the Rams, everyone knows what we're talking about, really, or had it on a tea towel or a biscuit tin at some stage. Do you have any first memories or impressions of the painting, any of you? Or where you first remember it from?
Oh, gosh, look, it goes so far back. I don't. It's just as you say, it's sort of seeped in with everything else that you learnt as a child. But, you know, I think, I might be kind of gilding the lily here, but I think even looking at it as a young girl, like maybe I was 8 or something like that, because we did have books of art at home, so come to think of it, I might have seen it there. I did think, okay, there's all those blokes, where are people like me? Very vaguely, this was way pre-feminism, or pre the second wave of feminism. I suppose I thought, and you know, along with that thought came the guilty thought, there's something wrong with me. Not only am I not in the country, but I'm not in this picture, you know, because I'm not a bloke. And that went, I think, as it did, I suspect, for many women and many city people, to think, oh, I'm kind of not a real Australian.
Sophie, was there any information about why he chose the characters that he chose in the painting, Roberts, when he painted?
Well, they're all real people,
yeah.
And they were all real people working at Brocklesby Station at the time. There's little sort of suggestions of things that he also brought in. Potentially, you know, the pink shirt of the main shearer is a suggestion of one of their friends who was a doctor in Melbourne at the time that they all sort of lived with and hung out with. And that pink shirt, that striped pink shirt, appears in a lot of Australian Impressionist works, portraiture. We know that, for example, the little kid in the middle right there, who's sort of the one face that is making eye contact with us, that's Susie Bourne, for example. She was a tar girl that was the daughter of the family that owned the sheep shearing shed, and that was her sister on the painting's left. We know that both of those girls had really long hair, 2 pigtails that were later painted out by Roberts at the last minute. X-ray sort of scans of the work that were completed in the 1960s shows 2 pigtails on both of those kids.
Wow.
That he made the active decision of giving them short hair after, which is interesting, right? When we're thinking about the erasure of, you know, other demographics and people in this picture. He made this conscious decision to make them boys.
Is there any insight into why he would have done that, or is that just maybe, I guess, what he was aiming for at the time, to depict rural Australia in this way?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the response, the contemporary response at the time, uses the word masculine to describe this painting. Even Tom Roberts himself, in letters to his friends while he was painting it, he talks about the strong masculine labour of the sheep shearing industry in Australia, and this was sort of coming to typify what, because, you know, Melbourne was the most wealthy city in the world at this point, not only in part because of the gold rush that had just come through Victoria, but now the shearing industry was the most lucrative industry globally. So there was this strength of force that Roberts was trying to impart in this work, and yeah, I think it was definitely a conscious decision to make those little girls boys.
Kate, you've done a lot of research back into this time when this painting was made, back in the late 19th century. What were women doing on the farm back then?
Well, first of all, I don't know if it was true then, and Andrew, you might have an answer to this, but I was recently near Gundagai. I have family there, and they shear a few sheep. And my step-nephew, I think he is, said to me, of course, women were not allowed in the shearing shed in the old days. If a woman approached the shearing shed, someone would say, "Ducks on the pond," which meant there's a woman coming, so be careful. I have no idea what ducks on the pond. I hope you might elucidate, Andrew, as someone who actually is involved with this stuff. So that's the first oddity about what you just said. I had not known that in the original they were sort of unashamedly girls. So, yes, partly to match that kind of pioneer heroic thing, which was strictly about the men, but also perhaps somebody said, actually, women are not allowed in the shearing shed. Anyway, that's for
What does that mean, ducks on the pond?
Does anybody know?
We were talking about this yesterday with
Oh,
my
right.
family, and it's, yeah.
Where does
is
it
it
come
like
from?
about to shoot?
So the saying probably originated there, but it expanded out into common usage. I did 20 years in the military, and that saying was used when you were having a conversation and maybe an officer was coming up behind you. You said, "Watch what you're saying." That's all it meant. Be careful what you say.
Right.
So not
There's
specifically
people
women.
that are going to listen that won't want to hear what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Behave yourself.
Yeah. It's
Well,
become common use.
I'm going to dig
phrase.
into that because, I mean, it does seem very bizarre, doesn't it? Ducks
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
pond. Maybe that's the whole
It's very
point.
hunter, you know. There's something,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
right?
Anyway, more on this later. You asked me a question about what would my grandmother grew up, who is the Dolly Maunder of this book. She grew up on a little farm not far from Tamworth, which was mostly sheep. And she was born in 1880, so, you know, she was 10 when this was painted, more or less. And my mother told a lot of stories about her mother, which her mother had told her. And one of the things Grandma was very kind of bitter about was that she had spent a lot of time in her childhood shepherding the sheep, because in the 1880s, even up to the 90s, I think, fencing wire was still a bit expensive. You couldn't just go out and do it. And labour was probably a bit cheaper than fencing wire. So it still made sense to build a wooden post and rail fence or some kind of wooden fence. So she spent time shepherding the sheep, because if you don't have fences, obviously you need somebody to kind of make sure they don't just go everywhere and to get them in at the end of the day. But her other job, as she grew older, because, you know, if you've been to the Middle East, you can see little kids are quite good shepherds. You often see them with a long stick and quite a big flock of goats or sheep. So she did that, but as she grew older, she was relegated to the kitchen, because all of those guys, look at them, big, husky guys, working very hard all day, they needed a lot of food. And in the kitchen, somewhere behind that, not in the picture, not in any picture as far as I know, are the women making, first of all, a gigantic cooked breakfast, and then Mum enumerated what they had to do for morning tea, huge heaps of scones, fruitcakes, sandwiches, plus enormous billies of tea with sugar. And then lunch, again, you know, a hot meal. These were men who expected a couple of chops. My grandfather's favourite lunch was a couple of cold chops and a hunk of strong cheese. When you're doing hard physical yakka, that's kind of what you need. Then in the afternoon, more. And in order to do any of those things, first of all, you had to get the fire going, which meant cleaning out the ashes, finding some kindling, finding some dry stuff to, like, probably they didn't have newspapers to light the fire with. So first you had to do that, and then you had to chivvy some man into chopping the wood. You could do it yourself, but it was pretty awkward because you were wearing these terrible long skirts. And then to make even something as simple as a cup of tea, you had to go out to the well or the tank and bring the water in. They would not have had, like, a tap, running water. Heat it up on the fire. If people wanted milk in their tea, you had to get the cow in from the paddock, find some hay to, you know, persuade it to stand still while you milk it, set it to separate if you were going to make the butter to put on the bread. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And the minute you'd finished one bit of this incredibly hard physical work, all of it would be gone. Mum said, you know, they'd sit down and in a moment, the whole work of hours would be gone. You'd have to turn around, clean up and start all over again for the next meal. I mean, it's the it's the fact about women's work, isn't it? Not only were women invisible, but the huge amount of essential labour that we did is not visible. Whereas those guys, at the end of the day, they could not only have their shearing tally, but also they had something quite concrete as an achievement to say, okay, all those bales of wool, we've done that. That's a permanent addition to the world. Sorry, I get quite excited about housework. Not doing it, but thinking about it.
How did you go about your research for this book and finding out this?
Research for this book was made easy for me. I couldn't have written it if my mother had not left a huge amount of fragments of family story. And she did that not because she thought we were anything to write home about, or actually the opposite. She knew that our family, coming from very modest country, but not squattocracy, very modest country, rural working class really, they were the vast majority back then, and yet their stories were never told. So my mother had this deep sense that those stories shouldn't be lost. So she told them to me, and when I was a child, I'm ashamed to say I wasn't very interested, and I didn't disguise the fact that I wasn't very interested. But luckily Mum lived long enough. She wrote down a lot of bits and pieces herself, and finally the penny dropped for me, and I got out the tape recorder and recorded her. So I had a wealth of family stories which had come directly from my grandmother, lots of actual phrases. I was very lucky about that. I did, of course, look at newspapers. I mean, we have this wonderful thing called Trove, and I looked up Thomas Henry Maunder, and one of the entries for him is that I couldn't find it again when I looked. Is 220 in a day, does that seem realistic to people in the audience who know about shearing? People are nodding with the blades? Okay, thank you. So Trove is a compendium, online of all the old newspapers, so you can find amazing things there. And of course I went to the place. I've also been in a few. I have watched a bit of shearing. My friends in Gundagai, my family in Gundagai, have allowed me into the shearing shed just for a few minutes, and I had to keep my distance and don't say anything. But they explained to me about those shoes which are in your sculpture there, special little shoes so that a shoelace or a bit of shoe couldn't accidentally get mixed up with the wool, because that would really, ruin things further down the track. Yeah, well. I've forgotten what you asked, but that was a long answer.
How you did your research, but yeah, that comes.
Yep.
Yeah. Was there anything surprising you found while digging through all these stories?
Look, I found some stuff about my grandfather, who was also a shearer. Look, nothing dramatic, because the thing about my mother was she didn't feel any shame about anything. My grandfather, the shearer, as opposed to my great-grandfather, the champion shearer, my grandfather Shearer was illegitimate. When Mum sent away for his birth certificate, she saw the word illegitimate written in huge letters all the way diagonally from one corner to the other. Honestly. But that was not a surprise. Mum had already done it. So I know a lot of families feel that there are secrets that should not be told, but I can only say if there are any in my family, they're so well hidden that I haven't found them.
Andrew, we want to talk a bit about your sculptures as well. How did you go about getting commissioned to do these ones of the Shearer? So it's a replica of Shearing the Rams, or just sort of influenced by?
Well, the right-hand image is of a shearer that I put at Muttaburra in the middle of Queensland. They gave me free rein, and I studied many images, and I decided on that look. The left-hand image is the one that is located at Losedale, 10 kilometres north of Corowa. The viewer's image on that photograph is the same as the main characters in the painting, and that was my brief, that had to be recognised or recognisable as something from that painting. My introduction to that painting started when I was very young, and it was of almost religious significance. Coming off a farm, we had cause to go to shearers' places, and as you said at the start, on the wall There was a tea towel or a cross stitch or a macrame or a blanket with that image on it, and it was treated with reverence. And it was as common as you'd find a crucifix or something like that in these working class homes. And when I was at school, they said, we are going down to the Victorian Gallery to visit this painting. It was almost like to visit a holy place. This is a significant journey you're going, and you're going to be privileged to be in the company of that painting. So when I got asked to build that, I thought, wow, you know, I better not stuff this one up because he's as popular as Elvis or the Pope. So yeah, that's how we got going there.
What did you discover, though, when you were sort of studying the painting a bit closer in terms of the proportions of the people?
Well, the way I started the process was I went to the pub in town and found a 6'2" shearer, coaxed him out to my farm with a carton of beer, and then with texture marks drew all his joints on and measured up his bones. I then built a skeleton, and then I built the head, hands and feet, and I had this was my guide, the thing, and so righto. So his legs are a little bit bent and his back looks parallel to the ground. If you look at that wall, that wooden wall beside him, his back looks sort of parallel with that. So that was my first indication of body position as a guide. Those two lines appear to be parallel. So then I put my frame, and I'd already built my ram. I put him over there and his hands don't reach the sheep. This led me to the conclusion that when Tom got home, he made a few changes. And I think what happened was, excuse me, in his original sketches, the shearer was probably more of an arched back leaning over and his head more concentrating downward on the sheep, which hid it from the viewer and wasn't as open to viewing from the public. So we thought, I want to open it up a bit, I want to show more of his head. So we raised his back up and then fudged everything else. So in order for me to create that sculpture over there in the same pose, I had to lengthen each arm by 3 inches and his spine by 4 inches and tilt it down a bit. So that was what I discovered in the building process.
So it's not quite accurate, a bit of artistic license.
Well, it's accurate from one view,
Yeah.
that it's like the painting, but his proportions are out in order to achieve that.
Yeah, right.
The illusion of naturalness. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you go about building your sculptures? I mean, they're so intricate and the detail on them is phenomenal.
I start with this posable, detachable frame. The sculptures all come apart like Lego, and I start with an internal frame that I can pose, much like a shop dummy. Once I've done that and I've built the head, hands and feet, and they go on, you can actually see how the sculpture's going to go, you know. And you don't have to have in your mind a complete picture. Now, I didn't have a vision of that. I just built this dummy, put his hands and feet on, and had a play with various movements of the head, hands and feet. And it revealed itself to me. Oh, that looks better than that, so I'll do that. Onto this steel internal frame that detaches like Lego, I then, using fencing wire, old rusting fencing wire, created, using radial armatures off the limbs, the 3D shape in fencing wire. Just the basic lines, front, rear, left and right. And then I could spend, with the help of a carton of Victoria Bitter, I could spend hours doing microscopic adjustments to that wire until I was very happy with the finished form. And because the arms were still posable and all the joints were, I had the full range of movement like a human, I could then still play around with that and do minor adjustments and do that. When I finally finished it, excuse me, that I was happy with the form, I would strengthen all the joints, remove all the ability for it to move, and then the arms and legs could come off, but they'd always come back into perfect alignment and like that. And once this wire form has been created, only then at the end you could progressively cut away the wire and add the steel artefacts that I'd sourced from the local community or clearing sales and market stalls and things like that.
You were commissioned to do 2 sculptures based around the Shearer. I guess, what do you think it is about that symbol of the Shearer that resonates with people so much, and they wanted you to recreate that still 100 years after this painting was made?
My belief is that the world is so rapidly changing, and people my age and older have seen such dramatic change so quickly that they're clinging to some anchor point from the past. And I think at the moment this is probably a good reminder of the good old days, or something that was what it used to be before all this computer stuff happened and internet and all that. And I think that's why it's popular. But its popularity is mainly with the age group I described, say 50 to 80 years of age and older. The younger people, they like to look at the form of the sculpture and maybe the movement, but the historical artefacts included in it, they're not connected to like the older people.
And I guess you've spoken to a lot of shearers, and it sounds like there's some shearers or sheep farmers in the audience today as well. I mean, shearing is not the same industry today as it was back then in 1890. I mean, a shearing shortage has been an issue for, I can't even remember how long, for as long as I've been doing the rural report. And it's a completely different industry, but still the symbol of the shearer is still an icon of regional and rural Australia, don't you think?
Absolutely. Like in most rural towns, there's shearers, and so that historical significance lives on still a continued line, and they're very proud. They're very proud, the shearers, that they're part of something noble, and that painting probably gave them that idea. That other people went, gee, that's good. Yes, I do that. and then come here, son, look at that. Oh, that's important. Oh, I do that, son. So I think a bit of that's going on.
Yeah, and I guess when people look at the symbol of the shearer, look at your sculptures. I mean, you must have this for a lot of your sculptures. You've done a whole range of things, from firefighters and all kinds of things. Do you think it's important for people to sort of see a bit of themselves in your artwork?
I think they've got to relate to the sculpture. So when I do a human forms, I try to have it radiating out some attitude that the viewer can recognise, and they go, oh, I know what he's thinking, or I've felt like that myself, and that's the link that connects them, and they go, yeah, I get it. Like I recently did one, Gingelic, a firefighter after the big fires and a fatality up there, and did a memorial sort of sculpture there. And the blokes there sort of, initially they wanted some heroic pose, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. That's done to death. I want to do a bit more subtle. And he's tired and he's exhausted, and he may have lost a mate in the fire, and all that's been captured there. And people can see that at a glance, and know there's something more than heroic pose, and that's what they connect with. And I think that's why I get more work, is there's a human attachment, or somehow they can picture themselves standing there in that role.
Yeah, a bit closer to reality, I guess. Yeah, of what it's really like.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah.
Annie, do you mind if I say something
about...
Because it was interesting when you were talking about the changing times, Andrew, because I want to just talk a little bit about how Tom Roberts also felt the same. And I think that that's a really interesting connection between your work and him. This was in the last decade of that century, and there was a lot of fear around the changing time, because things were changing so rapidly back then for that generation as well. There was so many changes happening in society, from train lines being connecting agriculture to the cities, for example. Things were being subdivided. People had to travel a lot further to get into the countryside. Women were coming into universities. There was just so much great change. And I think it's interesting because Roberts made a lot of active decisions around what he included in his work to tap into the nostalgia of the past.
Yeah.
So, for example, the shed that he chose, this was one of very, very few timber sheds at this point. By this part of Australian history, most shearing sheds were metal. And he actually had to go and find a timber shed that he wanted to paint this work of. And also the handheld shearers, they were also outdated by this point too. Most people by 1890 were using electronic shearers. So again, he chose that. He chose this kind of nostalgic representation of what a shearer may have looked like a decade prior to this, for example. And we see this in other works by the Impressionists in the 1890s. Frederick McCubbin's Pioneer, for example, the third panel of that work has a tiny city just in the background that you can just see on the horizon. And that's kind of emblematic of the industrialisation and the rampant industrialisation of the time. So a lot of people were very fearful of these changes, and they were wanting to hold on to a nostalgia and a past that they could relate to and that they could also see themselves in. And also, with the change of century, it was sort of like similarly to how people felt when the millennium came in. We were all a bit scared and thinking, what's the year 2000 going to hold? People actually felt exactly the same between 1890 and 1900. They were very thinking, what's this new century hold for us? And as somebody pointed out yesterday in our conversation, this was on the cusp of another great change when the Depression was looming in Melbourne. So although the shearing and the wool industry was so lucrative at this point, people were about to go bust. And I don't know how much Roberts could feel something like that brewing at this point, but I just think it's really interesting that you... No, you're okay. But I think it's interesting how you talk about, people wanting to hold on to something that they can recognise themselves in.
I think you're spot on there. Excuse me. I'm not sure how relevant it is today. If you look at the wide demographic of the Australian people, a very limited amount of people could identify with what's going on in there, either in their family history or themselves. And so, excuse me. Hand on to you.
Yeah, hand over.
All right, I'll give you a moment
got the tickle going.
Does anyone have
to recover the tickle.
We got strepsils.
As you were talking, I thought, yes, it's true there was fear of that change, but for some people that change represented a really good thing. For example, you reminded me that the shearers' strike was just about the time this painting, if I'm not mistaken, birth of the Labor Party, the whole Labor movement, the sense that working people had emerged from the feudal dark ages. There was a whole new thing, which was certainly very threatening to the kind of people who owned the shearing sheds.
Exactly.
But not to the shearers. So it's just another kind of aspect of it.
And I think that's true, right? That, when I see this work, I think about who is this work really for?
Yeah.
Because everybody is so happy in this work, right? And there's no sweats being broken, and everybody sort of looks like they're happily working under this invisible station manager, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this really is a work that is promoting the industry, a happy, homogenous labour industry, and it's not necessarily for the shearers, is it? It's
not really, because as you say, it was already being made. It's hard work anyway, shearing, but shearing with the blades.
Exactly.
And so that's already, as you say, an anachronism.
Yeah.
To sort of deny that change is happening in a very kind of, political. There's a huge political stuff that can be unpicked there about resistance to change, to give ordinary people a bit of power.
And not to mention, what our First Nations communities were going through at this time. This is a very happy white image of the Australian labour force.
McDonald's advertisement, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Visit to McDonald's looking at the staff,
Absolutely. And we talk about, there are artists, William Barrack and Tommy McRae, who are First Nations artists doing work on the same lands as Tom Roberts was here painting this shearing shed, and they were producing their own art and then being, shipped away to the missions and being stripped of their culture. So I just think it's really poignant to think about how happy and together and, there's such a political agenda in this work.
Absolutely. It may, of course, as you speak, in fact, I thought of this when I was preparing for this, looking very closely at all those faces and thinking, are there in fact some people with Indigenous, as there could well have been,
we know that there were.
But who probably would not have been terribly public about it?
Yeah, there were shearers though. There were black shearers at this point. They weren't paid the same, but they were in the sheds, yeah.
Andrew, I want to go back to a bit of what you were saying just before about this painting, and is it still relevant? You say that you don't think it is still relevant to today.
If you got 1,000 people and said, what's a painting you can relate to or something, I don't think this would rate highly, given our broad demographic today.
Yeah. I guess as an artist, if you were commissioned to create an artwork that reflected regional and rural Australia now, what comes to your mind and how you depict that?
I think a more accurate depiction would be someone working a market garden or a truck driver, and that could be any race. Maybe a group of mixed race people doing some activity, but not this picture here.
Yeah. Sophie, any thoughts on that? How we've moved on from the depiction of rural Australia now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I think something to do with the climate emergency, really, and if we were thinking about farmers, the struggles that farmers go through to do with climate change and fires and also an ageing population too, where young people are moving so rapidly away from regional communities because of this, because of the struggles and how hard that is. But I'm a city person, really. I'm in Melbourne and I love the country, but I think of it in this sort of romantic way, I guess. I love getting out to the country and breathing the fresh air and, listening to the trees, but I don't face the hardships that life in rural Australia is.
It's kind of an interesting point. I mean, this painting is so popular and so iconic, but most people who've seen it didn't grow up on a shearing farm shed or in a farm or in that environment, yet people can still relate to it or feel something when they see it.
It's interesting that in terms of public art, I mean, the people who commissioned you to do it, presumably it's partly a bit of a tourist thing for the town or some kind of... I'm thinking, is public art by its nature very often conservative or even reactionary, looking back to a kind of golden age?
I have found in my own experience, I've got 28 public artworks around the country, and what they want is the wow factor. It's not so much the message or the significance of this person. They want something visually stimulating that the younger people will like regardless of the message. That's what they're after.
The medium rather than the message. Yeah. And the fact that your sculptures are made out of kind of found objects, bits and pieces that you've picked up, and people can recognise it. Or when you showed me the one in the foyer, where there are beautiful little pearly things done by your wife, you told me, glass, I think, but they're actually just bits of bits of water pipe in profile that have been then filled in. So once you know that, it gives you a whole other... I mean, people love that, don't they? That sense that you've used ordinary things that we all know about to make art.
I think a lot of the popularity of my work, other than they get a bit of a wow when they look at it, but then those that spend a bit longer time looking at it, especially people 40 to 80 years of age, they will have a look at it and there'll be little objects in it that trigger a memory from their father or grandfather. And they might even be in the company of their father or grandfather. And you go, son, see that? That's a shifter off a Chamberlain tractor. It was a piece of shit. I hated it. You know, and oh yeah, thanks, Pop. And little stories and that I hated them. Well, they were really good. And the story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I just love sneaking into the crowd and listening to people talk about it, because they go on. And you know, yes, I had one of them. It was terrible. And it sort of adds some more life to the sculpture with every telling of every story. Then, you know, then I watch them, they'll take a selfie in front of it, right, and it spreads out, and it's sort of, I'm really happy sort of the words getting out.
Mm. And we were talking before, I'm sorry, I think you have something to say.
No.
We were talking before about how men quite often get inspired by that, to go off, you said, they go off to Bunnings and buy a few bits and have a go. And I immediately thought of one of my passions, which is quilting. So, and you said he'd never try and do a painting, but he's happy to go to Bunnings and do that, in the way that many women would feel much too shy to do a canvas and paint, but they'll start quilting, which is another kind of, you know, art sort of from below, if you like, using often scrap bits and pieces. Very often a quilt has in it, that's Grandma's old apron, or, you know,
oh yes,
that's the doll's house I made for you.
The Easter eggs inside the...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a whole, diversion really from the painting. But I suppose it's the other kind of art, isn't it? That's what you might call high art gallery art. And the quilts and perhaps things like this are another kind of powerful and connecting kind of art.
Real.
Yeah.
And I love it because you're telling the story of people using the objects from them. You know, you're using country, you're using their pieces of their lives to tell their own stories, and I think that's really beautiful.
I think that's why the parents at least like it. They've got some ownership of it, and especially if I can incorporate items from their community, there's a real strong bond.
Absolutely.
And you the other day about a sculpture you did where you actually inscribed the names of the children from that town.
Yeah. The excuse me. The Losedale sculpture, based on the painting, I wanted the community to get involved, so I did a talk to the primary school, and I asked the kids could they go back to their farms and get me some stuff, some good bits, you know, not just crap. And they did a good job. And I got a lot of cogs, not enough, but the cogs that form the shorn part of the fleece. You'll have a look at that later on, you'll see how it was done. There's the shorn part of the fleece and the fleece that's come away. I got a lot of them. So to repay the connection from the community, I stupidly got the wrong sort of steel for the centre of the cogs and welded all the cogs on, and then I had to engrave all the school children's initials on the cogs, and it was super hard steel. It cost me about $400 or $500 in Dremel engraving bits because it just chew through them like nothing. But eventually every kid from that school at that year has got his initials on that sculpture, and that'll be there for eternity. When they're an old person showing their grandchildren, they say, way back, this guy come to our school and that's me there. And so I've now got about 20 or 30 guardians of my sculpture that will clean it and protect it and say good things about it.
That's a good way to make sure your sculpture gets taken care of, yeah. Put everyone's name on it, yeah. Well, before we head off to ask any questions in the audience, I thought, any final thoughts from Sophie, Kate, Andrew that you want to discuss, or about the painting or what we've talked about today?
I just think it's really cool that this work still touches people, you know, and I think for the changing times, we look at works in different ways, and our readings of these works changes as our society evolves, and art is as dynamic as the people that read it. And I think it's great that you know, a work is still being spoken about and still touches people in the way that it does, even, and it makes us think, you know, it makes us think about the people in the work and the people excluded from its story. And I think it's a really lovely example of how art can just act as this gateway to talk about the world we live in. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to come and discuss that.
Look, I came not having not much time actually for that painting, and what has transformed for me is this discussion today. It's not so much the artwork, but as you say, it's a kind of trigger to a conversation about it. So that's, to me, that's all these fascinating things, and your sculptures are a big part of that, to think about the big picture of different kinds of art and what it does. So I will never look at that picture again without thinking of this discussion and all that it's... So it's like it's, not the art, but the meta-art, what the art does to us. So I guess the moral of that is we need to talk about it more. It's up on the wall, there's the little plaque written by somebody like you, but actually the best thing is when you sort of start just having an open discussion about it.
I'm very happy that doing this project has helped elevate my art form, not mine personally, but the art form of welding found objects together, from something that used to be called yard art or garage art, which was a couple of horseshoes to make a dog, into something that now a lot of the community consider it fine art. And the fact that myself and other people, when I started off, there was very few people doing this, and now I have inspired them, and a few other people have inspired thousands of other people to go out to Bunnings and buy a welder and have a crack. See, the blokes, they'd be a bit reluctant to get out the paintbrush and do that, but it's okay, blokey, to have a welder in the shed and knock up a chicken or a dog, you know, yeah, mate, yeah. You know. So it's getting people to do art therapy. Some people that have got trouble in life. I've had a lot of communication from people who said, thank you, you've inspired me to do that, and I was having a hard time, and me doing this art in the shed has helped me get through it. And so this project, because it's got pretty good wide coverage on the internet with the welding and blokey sort of areas, a lot of people have taken it up and are saying thank you. You know, not just to me, but I'm glad I've been part of that, and that something that was a bit obscure garden art or yard art is now a movement that's spreading rapidly across Australia. These scrap metal artworks are appearing everywhere. When I started, there was no one. Now you only have to go 100 kilometres and you'll find another artist like me competing against me. It's gone that big, and I don't know when it'll die. Maybe when the age group that likes it, when we all pass on, that'll be the end of it, and they'll get the scrap metal people to come in and cart them away. But I've got a few years left, so I'm very happy.
I think so. Well, you guys happy to take some questions from the audience? I will open it up to you. Anyone with a burning question?
Hi, this is a confluence of events, but last week on Facebook, on the Beechworth page actually, there was an amazing post someone put up that the Burke and Wills sculpture's gone into hibernation for 5 or 6 years, and that person had apparently put forth the idea of bringing it to Beechworth and we look after it for a little while and have it on display where it's got historical relevance to the town as well. Anyway, it sent me down that rabbit hole of investigating, is this really a reasonable proposition? And you might be able to shed some light on it, that option, which probably is highly unlikely, but I know these things fall into the realm of collection development and policy and, you know, individuals that control where art actually belongs at any one time. But I think in me it generated that feeling of like, it is public art. I'm sad to see that go into hibernation. Does it have to be away for that period of time? I know conservation's part of the plan, and I imagine that takes a significant amount of time, but how much of that stuff does have the ability to be moved around into different locations and enjoyed by people that are putting their hand up and saying, hey, it looked good in our space for a while, particularly when it's historically relevant? Thoughts?
Sophie might be you have any insight into?
Yeah, I mean, the conservation of these objects is critical, right? And there's so much discussion these days around these public monuments. And I think it's great that small towns want to put their hand up and say, you know, we'll have that for a while. And I mean, for me, to be honest, it sparks a kind of want to take pause, and I don't know, I'm trying not to be too, politically minded, I guess, about this, maybe. But I think for me it would be a good opportunity for that to be taken away. That's my personal thought. Just if it was going away for a short time, I think it could be a really good opportunity to take pause and to sort of consider why we want these monuments, and to think about the stories that they are sort of permeating in our cultures. I mean, the story of Burke and Wills is an interesting one, right? And I think that we, you know, like a lot of these public monuments, we walk past and we kind of, you know, without really questioning what the story of these you know, white men are. And Burke and Wills, we know, you know, they died, right? They died of starvation because they were offered help by First Nations people into their travels and how to eat bush tucker, right? But they rejected that help. They didn't want to, say yes to help by blackfellas, and they ended up dying because they didn't cook the berries in the correct way that the blackfellas were trying to help them with. They were trying to save them, and they rejected their help, and they ended up dying of starvation because the berries needed to be cooked. And if they weren't cooked, they do something to your intestines where you basically starve to death. You can't take on any more nutrition. And so they were writing these letters at the time to say that, you know, there's evidence that they were tried to be saved by the blackfellas out there. And I think that that's a real, you know, lesson in our history. And I don't love these monuments still being in our towns without proper context and the real stories behind these people. I don't necessarily mind them staying, but I think taking them away for some time and allowing us to think about how we contextualise these moments in history and maybe who else needs to be represented. Maybe it's a good opportunity for that monument to be replaced for a little while with somebody else that is equally important in our history books.
I think it's a really interesting one. But I think the story goes away when they're not in front of your eyes. So that story might be in front of Melbourne people's eyes, and you're growing that awareness. But back out here in the smaller community regions, maybe it's time that can actually promote that story.
Exactly, and that's about contextualisation, isn't it? It's about how we tell these stories. You go, Kate.
Well, look, this discussion is really interesting because it brings up that whole question of, you know, the people who put pour red paint on the statues of Captain Cook, that sort of thing. When I was in Perth, the historian Henry Reynolds told me to go and look at a huge memorial sculpture in Fremantle, which was dedicated to 3 explorers who were treacherously murdered by the natives, all of that in inverted commas. Huge thing glorifying this. And he said to me, the interesting thing about this is that's still there, but on it at the bottom is another big plaque that says, we people find this offensive. Here is the other side of that story. Those treacherous natives were in fact people defending their homelands and their families. So that seems to me a really good way of dealing with this whole thing.
Yeah.
But you've got to be quite explicit about it. You read that other plaque and you never look at a statue the same way again.
I find it interesting as well. There's a lot of portraiture around Burke and Wills, and they're often painted alongside the berries that they ate. But there's never any actual context and discussion about
The role the berries played.
Yeah, pretty critical role that those berries played. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's all about, and I hear what you're saying completely. It's not necessarily about taking them away, although maybe it's necessary to take this away. I don't know the exact situation in terms of the conservation of this work, but I think that we need to have a good hard look at how we're presenting these monuments in our towns, and also just create more about the people that deserve for their stories to be told. Just read a Kate Grenville book and build a sculpture of the people that she talks about, the invisible people in our stories.
Isn't it interesting, like, we're discussing artworks, and then at the time the duck's guts, just fantastic, can't fold them, and then as time passes, the other bits of the story come in, and then all of a sudden they're vandalised, and then you think about, globally, you think about these magnificent sculptures in sandstone in the desert or whatever, you go, how could anyone take a sledgehammer to those sculptures? They're so beautiful. Well, the same thing happened there, I imagine. The narrative changed, and no, he was a bastard. We'll take his head off or take his nose off. It's constantly evolving, isn't it?
People are angry.
Yeah.
And the story changes as time goes on. Yeah. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah. Comment?
It's not really a question, it's a comment, and it really is around the culture and women. And I'm sitting here with my 85-year-old dad, who started shearing at 18 here in Victoria, and then went to South Australia and was a shearing contractor for 35 years in the station country of South Australia and New South Wales. And I was an 18-month-old baby when I was first with him and Mum, and so it was our life. So Shearing of the Rams wasn't on our wall because that was our life. And I find it really incongruent that the girls are there because they would not have been in the shed at all at that time. The owners' girls would definitely not have been in that shed. My mum was on a shearing station in the mid-north, the far north of South Australia, and when she talks about as an 8-year-old, she was on her horse at 8 with her own set of shears and her dog going around pulling out bogged sheep out of the dams on Christmas Day with her sandwich. So that's what she was able to do, but she wasn't allowed into the sheds. So that goes to what you're talking about, Kate. So, having women, the union was so strong. So it was really, as Dad said, in the 1970s, before women were actually allowed into the sheds in anything other than, you weren't allowed to have a man anywhere, a woman anywhere. There had to be a man in the cookhouse. When I went and started as a 16-year-old after I finished Year 12 as a rouseabout with Dad, there were very few rouseabouts in the teams anywhere. They were there, and there had been some women go through in South Australia in the Marston School of Wool to be wool classes. But if we met other teams in the pub, they would say, "Are you the cook, love?" And I'd go, "No, I'm running the board. I was younger and fitter and could run for six minutes. Can't do that anymore." But the women, women now, and I'm sitting alongside this lovely lady and we are talking about women who are champion shearers themselves, who can shear 300 plus sheep a day, and that would never have happened way back. And when this was being painted, we already had unions in place, and the Labor movement was already in place. There was already unions in Queensland. The strikes were happening. The strikes were happening in Victoria. There was already a union in Ballarat. So I guess women were always in the forefront, but I just find it was the first time I actually ever thought about them being girls and those plats being painted out because they would not have been there. So I find that quite fanciful for Tom Roberts to have painted that in there. And so it makes me think about the actual realism of that painting when I look at it now, because I've looked at it in the past and I've seen it. And I married a squatter. I married into the squattocracy. Squattocracy. I did, and it was still alive and well in the 1980s. But that looked like what it was. I mean, you did carry the rams out and all that was right, but there would not have been any women there. Would that be right, Dad?
I would say.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I've got a champion female shearer in the family. Like, the amount of women that are actually on the boards these days is a huge growing population.
Yeah.
And one last thing to that, the romance about the shearing industry, it's like a history portal. You still have to get wool off the sheep's back, and the only mechanisation that's gone with that is the introduction of the plant, but it's still the same process, getting wool off the actual animal. And it's like stepping back in time every time you go into a shearing shed.
And I will then hand this over, but as my brother said, who started in the sheds at 14 years, it is still the last industry where you go off to work in the morning with your sweat towel over your back and your water bottle in your hand.
Thank you so much.
I think just on that point on the girls, I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting that I think when Tom Roberts was in the shearing shed, it was a bit of a situation that there was a famous artist in there. So we know, I mean, I've spoken to Susie Bourne's descendants, and so that is her and her sister, and that's maybe not life, and we know that Roberts paid them sixpence, paid the little girls sixpence to kick up the dust and make the shed more realistic.
Yeah, right. One last question. Maybe we can...
This lady's had her hand up for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Hello. So I don't want to be pushy, but...
We'll come here first.
Michael Leunig has a well-known cartoon called Ramming the Shears. Is that sacrilege, or is it Michael saying, don't take it too seriously? What's your reaction to the space?
I think I laughed my guts out when I saw that. It was sacrilege. It was, but that's what made the cartoon so popular. That was the magic of it. It was sacrilege.
Yeah, it's a state-owned artwork. I mean, I think have at it. It's cool. It's funny. Was there one last?
Are you happy to do one more question? I think we started a bit late. I sat on a microphone.
Just
sorry.
this lady, yeah.
But we've got one more question up the front.
This lady's
just
in the
here.
She's been very patient.
Yeah.
There might be someone here from Corowa, Phil and Ginny maybe, who have some more information. But in talking to one of Susie Bourne's ancestors, Dorothy Ambrose, who has since passed away, the story was, aside from them kicking up the dust, that they had stolen some of his paints and put some paint on the shearing shed. And apparently he then said, right, because you've done this, you're going to be in my painting.
Yeah.
Something like that. Phil and Ginny, do you know any more?
I've spoken to them about that too, actually.
I'm Susan Bourne's great-granddaughter.
Oh,
Wow.
It's great to have you. Hi.
I find it interesting that you're saying that Sophie was in the painting. As far as I know, she's not.
Oh, her sister?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because the boy with that fleece, I have his name here, is that who you're saying is Sophie? Where is Sophie in the painting?
Well, Susie's the one in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that the other one that wasn't a little boy, the other one? The one on the left?
No, that's John.
Oh, that's...
I can't pronounce his surname. But I believe that Tom Roberts took sketches of Gran and finished the painting of her when he finished it in Melbourne. So Sophie's not in them.
Oh, that's interesting.
But they did have to walk into Corowa when they got into his paints and painted some of the board. So it was quite a long way from Redlands into Corowa for two little girls.
Right.
And I do believe that Gran's mother cooked for Tom Roberts, so possibly you could assume that she cooked for the rest of the shearers as well.
That's such an amazing piece of family legacy for you all. How incredible.
What does this painting mean for you, having that family connection to it?
It's pretty special.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very special.
Well,
And also, when they had the bicentennial here in 1988, was it? Our eldest daughter played her great-great-grandmother.
Wow. Oh, that's fantastic.
In the reenactment that they had at, I think, Wodonga.
Oh. Well, thanks for coming today and
Pleasure.
putting your hand up. It's great to know. Wow. Well, I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Got a long list of thank yous. Thank you to Elise, our stage manager, Kofi, our sound person today, and the amazing Aimee Chan, who I can't see but who has done an amazing job as the festival coordinator. Hi, Aimee. And helped pull this panel together and done a lot of the work. And lastly, a big round of applause for our panel: Andrew Whitehead, Kate Grenville, Sophie Gerhard, NGV.